Well, good morning. Good morning, and thank you for taking time to attend our second summer series. I'm Catherine Sorensen. I'm with the Department of Health, Maternal and Child Health Branch, and I'm the Child Abuse and Neglect Prevention Coordinator. This morning, we have Dr. Suzette Fromm-Reed, who serves as an associate professor and founding chair of the National Louis University's PhD program in community psychology. I first heard Dr. Fromm-Reed she was a plenary speaker at a conference that was a few months ago. And before her presentation was even over, I knew I wanted to bring her to Hawaii and to bring her research and the information that she has. It's just so spot on, and I think critical for the work that we're doing here in the islands. Dr. Fromm-Reed was recognized by the American Psychological Association as part of a select group of women in leadership. Her PhD program receives an award for excellence in education programming from the American Psychological Association as well. Prior to coming to the National Louis University, she led nonprofit child welfare organizations at both the national and local level. She holds an MA in clinical psychology and a doctorate degree in psychology and public interest. Her research and recent publications all focus on the buffering role of resilience between ACEs in mental health and physical health, as well as academic and employment outcomes. In 2019, she was an invited guest to the American Psychological Association's first summit on ACEs and is a sought-after invited speaker for national and international audiences on ACEs and community resilience. Please welcome Dr. Suzette Fromm-Reed.
Hello all. What a strange way to present, right? I'm looking at a screen and I'll be staring at my PowerPoint, so I won't see you. So if you're chatting and raising hands, Catherine and Kathleen are going to handle that. And thank you so much, Catherine, for having me and for all your kind words. Okay, let's jump right in. So today we're going to do things a little bit differently. We're going to start talking about using our brains, and let me move this so it doesn't get in the way. Using our brains to create safe, connected, and empowered organizations and communities. So let's just step back and think of the big picture, the agenda today. We're really going to reframe our approach to working on adverse childhood experiences. And how are we going to do that? By linking brain research and community research. Most of the work that we do is fixing individuals and is kind of teaching people to pull themselves up from their bootstraps or resilience and grit, and it's individually focused. We're going to try to shift that frame a little bit and consider some complementary approaches. We're going to do that by looking at a path to resilience that is made from creating safety, connections, and empowerments in our settings, whether that be your community, geographic community, community of people, a organizational community. I will use these terms somewhat individually. We're really talking about looking at the context instead of the individuals in the context. And I'll give you some specific organizational and community actions that we can do related to regulating what we'll soon know, and you may know, to be called the stress response system. That's what's happening in our brain when we react to things. So you heard about me a little bit, but I feel a need to give you a little more. Yes, I'm a psychologist. I analyze brains. I am not a neuroscientist. I have cut up brains. That sounds terrible, but when I was in grad school, yes, I've sliced brains apart in physiology classes. That's not my expertise. I am a community psychologist who was trained with both community and organizational psychologists. So I look at the setting, I look at the context, I look at the people inside of the context, and my focus is not solely on the individual, it's on the context. What can we do at the community, the organization, or whatever that context is? I am a professor now, which is ever so strange because I'm a social service girl. I came out of child welfare, both national Prevent Child Abuse America and local level child welfare in the Chicago area. And I feel like my heart is still there and with probably where many of you are at this time. So my take on this is a little bit different than a traditional clinical psychologist, which is where I started. when we look at the brain and the community, so you've probably heard the term brain architecture. If you look on the left-hand side, that's the brain getting built almost like a puzzle, piece by piece. What are the pieces? All the pieces are our early experiences that we have when we're young. These are all the things that go together. They literally create the architecture of our brain and how we respond to things throughout our lifespan. And on the right-hand side, you have community capacity building. This is really the whole community and building the capacity using all of our building blocks, our individuals, our families, community and organizational agencies, and social and policy implications there. So as a community psychologist, I come into this and I don't just look at the individual. You may have seen the Oprah special, and we were ever so happy when she did this, and she says, stop asking what's wrong with you and start asking what happened to you. And we're like, yes, but there's another question. Turn the finger around, start looking at ourselves and what are we doing to create settings where everybody can thrive, and not just looking at what we can do to fix broken individuals. So as community practitioners, you know this. I don't know how many years you've had in the field. I've been around a little while. Inequality is increasing, as is exposure to traumatic events. Our current strategies, we do this top-down adoption, even adoption of trauma-informed practices. It's a step in the right direction, but it might not be enough. We need support here. We need to build more fences. You may have heard of the prevention parable, quit pulling people out of the river and go upstream and build a fence. We need to do both. We need to do trauma-informed practices. And once we get people that have fallen in the river, so to speak, we need to put bandages on them, but we also need to spend a little bit more time building these fences. And that requires trainings like this one. I'm planting a seed today. Mindset changes. Let's not just point the finger at the individual. And that also requires the harder things, the decentralization of community efforts and systemic efforts to build community capacity. I won't get you all the way there today, but at least we'll plant a couple seeds. Setting expectations. Forgive the business growth model. Some of you do run agencies. Some of you might run a public health agency or a local social service agency. You're not about the profit and the profit margins, but you need to understand. I probably need to hide this bottom thing here so you can see there. Maybe that's a little bit better. So that you can see that we're just planting seeds and it's not a linear path. First, you're going to understand, and then you're going to implement, and then you're going to come back and try to understand some more, and then you'll try some implementation. You are the experts of your setting, and there is no one size fits all scenario. I can't give you a checklist. I can give you some ideas, and we can start planting some seeds today in this 50-minute session, and then we can come back and do some more hands-on later if that makes sense. But you are the experts on how you apply this to your setting. In Washington State, you may have watched Paper Tigers and all of that. The work that I've done there with them, we came up with this idea, and this was our original model. It's called our KISS Community Capacity Building Framework for building resilience in the community. The 4 key elements are knowledge, insight, strategies, and structures. We're starting here with knowledge. All of this is knowledge. It took me a long time to consume ACEs as a new language because I come out of child maltreatment world and we did not use this terminology when I was in that world. So you have some knowledge and then you move to that insight. The clinicians in the room get this. That's that aha. You're not acting this way to irritate me. This is your brain's response to something, that aha moment. Our strategies we'll touch on today. What are some things we can do in our settings? Structures are harder. That's policy changes. That's changing the way that the organization functions. It may change funding streams. It may change laws. We won't really get there today, but know that they're important. Okay, language matters in this introduction. I want to make sure we at least put that out there. Trauma, resilience, way overused terms. If you do a Google search, you get almost 300 million hits. I want to note that trauma is the subjective experience of an event. It may or may not happen. We talk about ACEs as trauma. ACEs may or may not lead to trauma. It depends on the individual's subjective experience of those events. And a lot of that depends on the resilience factors that they have in place that we will talk about later. resilience equally overused. So what does it actually mean? It depends on the context. I will do the same thing to you. I'm going to use community context and organizational resilience kind of interchangeably because it depends on what you're looking at. Are you looking at a geographic community? Are you looking at a community of people? All of them can be used interchangeably. So let's just set the language stage there. So let's move on. I'm sure you've heard, you know about ACEs, maybe a little bit of the impact on the brain, but I want to start with what you know as a building block and then build you up. I'll go through the ACEs information a little bit quickly because I'm going to guess you've heard about the CDC Kaiser Permanente study done from 95 to 97 with close to 17,000 people in Southern California. Important to note, middle-class individuals. These were not extreme outliers. And what they were studying was obesity. They were asking people to think back to their first 18 years of life and what happened. And what they found was that the leading cause of death was abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. They've come up with several pyramids since that, but all of them include the elements of abuse categorized in these light blue: physical, emotional, neglect, physical, emotional. And the household dysfunction is one that people sometimes need to think through: mother treated violently, substance abuse, mental illness, separation of parents, or incarceration. I put the asterisks here, coming from a Chicago context. Immigration and fear of deportation are huge. And what I want to note here, when we do research, population-based research, we like to stick with the same way of defining our variables. So when we talk about ACEs and we're trying to compare a whole body of research, we have 100 studies over here and 20 studies over here, we like to consistently measure those. So just because we like to consistently measure those from a research standpoint does not mean in your individual setting or for your individual work that these are the only 10 that ever matter. It means that when we're trying to look at population trends, we try to use the same language. So everyone's often, what about this as an ACE and what about that? Yes. However, we spent the first 2 hours of the American Psych Association Summit talking about measurement, and all agreed in the end, it's best to stay apples and apples when we're measuring these things. Doesn't mean more deeper dives, and in your individual context, you can't consider other things. The pyramids changed over time, the colors have changed over time, but at its core, if you look like 3 rows up, we have adverse childhood experiences leading to disrupted neuro development, leading to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, which leads us to health risk behaviors that are maladaptive and early death. We've added the bottom 2 layers of considering social context and considering historical trauma and generational embodiment of trauma. All of this will be kind of the thread of what we're talking about. How do you tie some of these lower levels of the local context together with all the other things that we're seeing, the brain development and the actions of individuals? A little bit on the brain. I already told you I'm not a neuroscientist, but let's tie these things together. ACEs can alter the structural development, literally, of the neural networks and the biochemistry of the brain. And they have long-term effects on the body, including speeding up disease and aging and compromising our immune systems. This is a well-known, perhaps overused slide, but I think it tells the point. If you look on the left-hand side, we have a healthy brain. And you see up at the top on the left-hand side by the circles, lots of red. The red and the yellow and the green, those are our high activities. If you put your hand on your forehead, you're going to know this is my frontal lobe. That's where all that red is, in the frontal lobe on the left side of the healthy brain here. That's where we logically process and do sequential reasoning. I can plan, I can execute, I can take in information about an emotion and put it in the context of where I am and plan 3 steps ahead. Where the circles are, I still see a lot of high activity. You see that at the bottom, if you can catch that coding with my menu down there, the reds, the greens, and the yellows are your high activity. This is how I regulate emotions. Now, if you looked on the right-hand side, this is an abused brain, severely abused in a Romanian and neglected in a Romanian orphanage. You see a lot of black and purple. This is somebody who's having great difficulty receiving input from their senses about emotions and knowing how to regulate them. So I show you this because I think for many people, when we start talking about ACEs, when it really hits home is when you see what's actually happening to somebody's brain. So we have decades of research on the clear demonstration between the neurobiological and epidemiological findings and what we see in practice, right? This is an old, way over busy chart from Validi et al. From 2006. I still love it. If you look in the middle, the demonstrated neurobiological defects, these are each different studies that are showing actually what's happening in the brain on all of these topics that we're interested in. So if we look at the top row, anxiety, panic, depression, hallucinations, substance abuse, it's telling you in the middle column, well, this repeated stress leads to the hippocampus and the amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex. We're going back to that logical reasoning, atrophy. So it's not growing in the same way, it's declining. And this is the dysfunction we see when we say anxiety and mood. I just find this ever so cool because, again, not the neuroscientist, but when you look at this, there's study after study after study as we go down here, clearly showing the neurobiology and the epidemiological findings, what's actually happening in the brain that leads to smoking and alcohol use and obesity. There are changes in our brain. That's that architecture. The brain architecture is changing. I have done my homework. There are more recent studies on this, so we don't just go back to 2006. A couple of key ones to think about. Lots of studies are showing connections between cognitive, that's our thoughts, and affective, that's our emotion, the processing of our brain. The more ACEs we have, the more we have a heightened attention toward threatening stimuli. So we all do this. We all have these monkey brains that jump around. And I swear just yesterday I was saying, it is not a bear. It is not a bear. I am not being chased by a bear, because that's how we feel in that moment, right? Heightens experience of loneliness if you have many ACEs, which this is a chicken and the egg, because you also have social cognitive functioning issues. What does that mean? I'm not thinking through logically how I act in social situations, so I might not be so likable. Maybe I am lonely because I don't have as many friends, because I don't know how to respond to the cues, the emotional cues that I get and the cognitive cues that I get. And I'm looking at everything as a threatening stimuli. So my social interactions, including aggressive behaviors, are heightened when I have higher ACEs. So you probably know a lot of this. We're just setting the stage for where we're going with it. I love this chart because it's showing you on the left-hand side, out of 100 people, 33%, only 33% have no ACEs. So what does that mean long-term? Well, if I have no ACEs, 1 in 16 smoke, 1 in 480 use IV drugs, and 1 in 96 attempt suicide. 51% sits somewhere in the middle with 1 to 3 ACEs. And if I'm lucky enough to have 3 ACEs, my rate of smoking jumps to 1 in 9. IV drug use went from 1 in 480 to 1 in 43. And look at the suicide jump, 1 in 96 to 1 in 10. Doesn't mean every person with 3 ACEs has this. It means statistically population-based. This is where we sit. Now look all the way over on the right, only 16% of the population reports 4 to 10. If you're in that category with over 7, 1 in 6 smokes, 1 in 30 uses IV drugs, and going all the way down, 1 in 5 attempts suicide. So this is why we're here. This is why we do what we do. I also like, with that industrial organizational hat on, to think about this not just as those we serve as clients, but as us, US workers in mental health. Mental health issues impact all of us. We were just chatting before this started about the rate of anxiety in teenagers. This is a byproduct of our society, and we need a culture shift, right? So 37% of work productivity is impacted by mental health issues, and 61% of work environment contributes to mental health issues. So we have some responsibility, especially those of us with high caseloads that are always busy and we're dealing with challenged individuals to begin with, to make sure our setting is proper so all of us can be regulated, exhibit self-regulation, and help be in the best position to help other people. Good news, there's hope. Taking it back to the brain, there's this concept called neuroplasticity. We'll just call it brain plasticity. The brain can adapt and change. It can in type 1, you can look at it from a structural plasticity, where literally the brain structures are changing. That's that brain architecture. You saw that word like atrophy earlier on. That's when the area of the brain is reducing. We can change our brain's development. Up to about 30, we're still pretty pliable in our brain structures. And we still have other hope. If you think of someone that's had a stroke, they have what we call functional plasticity over there on the right. The brain is this amazing thing that can work around the bad spots. Like, I can't do that, but I'll go this way and I'll work around it. So there's hope. So what do? We know the ACEs are bad, they're connected to the brain, and let's talk a little bit about what we can do to reframe the way we look at ACEs. Let's remember, trauma, I said this earlier, is an overused term. It's the sum of the event. So we had 7 ACEs, 3 ACEs, 4 ACEs, that's what we're calling the event. But in between the event and the effect of that event is how one experiences it. How do I make meaning of the event? And it's usually influenced by their development, their culture, and their context or their environment. That's where we're going to focus our time and attention. That's what I look at when I think about resilience, community or contextual resilience. What can we do? We can't get rid of all ACEs. We can't any more than we're getting rid of all poverty in our lifetime. But what can we do to start working on creating environments where even if I had several ACEs, I can still thrive? For those clinicians in the room, you'll probably remember Judith Herman, a big psychologist known for her work on trauma and recovery dating back to 1992, just reminding us that, trauma is the outcome. It's intense fear, helplessness, loss of control, threat of annihilation. That's my subjective experience of what happened to me. ACEs are objective. Did you have this? Didn't you have this? Did you have this? Didn't you have this? So trauma and ACEs are not the same thing. ACEs may lead to trauma. We're going to work on making sure that they don't. So I'm a researcher in my other life. Many moons ago, I worked for Harvard University's Project on Human Development in Chicago neighborhoods. This was an 8-year longitudinal study where we were trying to figure out, in short, what's going right and what's going wrong in our communities. Found some interesting things I'll tell you about in just a second. And then we built on that work and brought it to Washington State to find some kind of similar events. All of the research that we are aware of on community resilience related to ACEs and child maltreatment is encapsulated here. We have a new publication coming out. They don't put it out till 2022, but it's been accepted in the American Psychologist that details this. But it's hard work to do, and it's so much easier to focus on the individual. So there's not a lot of research out there on this, but here's a couple of large scale studies that I can tell you about. So the Harvard Project, I did this research in 2004, and I examined nearly 9,000 Chicago residents broken down into 343 neighborhood clusters. Yes, if you know anything about Chicago, we have 77 neighborhood areas, but we broke it down into a different clustering. In short, what we found here is that there was less child maltreatment when people had each other as resources. So when I had community or contextual resilience, I had a neighbor that I could borrow sugar from that would watch my kid if I needed to, even if I had the same rates of abuse, if I had the same rates of poverty, single parent households, density, percent minority, even in those communities, I had less child maltreatment when I had community resilience, which gave us some hope at a large scale. We knew this was true for other things like juvenile delinquency, but I believe that my study was the first to look at it with child maltreatment. Just a side note on that, this was 2004, 9 years after the ACEs study. And at that time, I had never heard of an ACE. I didn't know what an ACE was. So not a word of my research talked about ACEs. There's silos in these kind of work. So years later, Laura Porter and her team in Washington found my research and said, hey, I wonder if this holds true in Washington State. What a different context. So we did it there. We examined 118 communities across the state, and we were really looking at ACEs, poverty, and racial ethnic composition as predictors of mental and physical health, school performance, ability, work, and coping behaviors. I don't know if you know this, but in large scale research, what we tend to do is we look at predictive factors. So you'll always see things like it's called socioeconomic status, or that's like poverty and median income level, percent on unemployment, things like that will go into these indices. And then we look almost at a sociological level of what predicts the bad stuff that's happening in our communities. And when you look at the research, you have 30 years of basically blaming individuals, like single minority women have high rates of child abuse. Great, that's terrible, but doesn't tell me anything about what to do. So we wanted to look at, well, what can we do? Where's the resilience factor here? We looked at several different types of resilience. Resilience, as you know it, probably at the individual level, that social emotional support. This is that grit, which I have a little, I don't love grit, mastery and optimism, because it's still pointing the finger at the individual. We looked at community for adult. These were social capital, social cohesion. What does that mean? How together do you have that neighbor you can rely on? Collective efficacy, the belief that together we can create change in our community. And then we had the community and youth perspective, which was, did you have protective supports? Families and adults, peers, schools and neighborhoods and communities. And interestingly enough, what we ended up finding was that the contextual factors did serve as a buffer. Contextual and individual resilience together were working for adults, but only the contextual factors worked for kids. So we spend all this time building up grit and working on mastery and working on self-confidence. I think that's great. I have a 15-year-old, I'm a parent. I know these things are necessary, but what's more important for children is that they have adults and parents that can rely on them. They have a sense of community amongst friends at their high school. They have what we'll get into later, these positive childhood experiences, or the resilient contextual factors that they can rely on. So really interesting research. And we talked about the protective factors. So we know a little bit, you're going to trust me, we need to build fences. ACEs are impacting our brain, and we have some research indicating that the community or the context is where we should be focusing our energies. But what about the brain? Let's go back to the brain. What's that have to do with it, and how the heck does it work? Let's talk about that. Positive childhood experiences. Bethel et al. In 2019 coined the term positive. This is one way we could view resilience. Let's just think through these. If I'm a child, my ability to talk to my family about my feelings. Do I feel like my family stands by me? So there's several levels here, but the family being one. Community. Are there community traditions? Do I feel a sense of belonging in high school? Do I feel supported by my friends? Do I have non-apparent adults who take a genuine interest in me? Just pause on that for a minute, because I think when we want to approach this, it's such a big problem that we think we need a big answer. And I'm suggesting to you that it all starts with the little building blocks. The taking that minute to show a genuine interest to the child who you might only know from, I don't know if you guys have dog parks in Hawaii, but for me, I spend a decent amount of time at dog park. Like, really, tell me about that project. Just an interest, just opening up, feeling safe and protected. My husband came out of the foster care system, and I feel like I'm constantly speaking a different language to him. So I said, you know, it's really awesome what you're doing with our daughter, where you're just having these open conversations with her and she feels like she can talk to you. I said, it's not just about feeling like you're going to get beat when you come home. It's about feeling like there's this nice little safe nest to fall into, even if your biggest daily challenge was just a boy that said something mean to you. It's a little safe buffering nest. And I think we have to realize where everyone's coming from sometimes and understand it's almost like you're teaching a different language, particularly if you're working with anybody who comes from a history of high ACEs. So very, very positively, we find that with positive experiences, there's this dose effect. What does that mean? With ACEs, we have a dose effect. The more ACEs you have, the more bad stuff you have later in life. On a population level, doesn't apply to every individual. The same thing happens with positive experiences. The more of these things that I have, the less likely I am to have poor mental health and depression later. So that's very promising that we can do this. Yeah. Okay. But how? You're telling me all of this, Suzette, but I don't know how to do it. Let's go back to our building community resilience. We're going to do it with a KISS. In the upper right-hand corner, that's the old model, the visual that we were using. I like it because there's little footprints and it's a step, but it's certainly not a linear path. You're going to go from knowledge to insight, back to knowledge again, try out some strategies and come back to knowledge. And every now and then you're going to step into that structural change, some policy land. Right now we're planting the seeds, knowledge. You're going to then spread knowledge. There'll be a couple of aha moments. Oh, I didn't really understand that until now. It took me about 9 months or a year. And that was post all that research I did with Harvard. It took a while to take on this new language and understanding. So plant the seed and start to water it. So we know ACEs are bad. We know community could be the answer. Let's tie this knowledge part, that K in the KISS, back to brain science. But let's specifically, when we talk brain science, talk about it in the terms of threat response system. And you know what this is, you just might not know you know what this is. And I'm going to tie that to our community responses. What is the threat response system? Fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and you might not have heard of the flock. And there's some controversy over the flock, but I'm going to put it down here. What are these? This is how we initially react. So earlier I gave you some research and I showed that we do have research showing that people with high ACEs have a heightened sensitivity to external stimuli. They're more likely to be more aggressive because when they take in a stimuli, their reaction is fight. Their reaction might be flight. I have students that do this all the time in my doc program. They're like hiding somewhere and you got to knock, knock, knock. It's safe to come out. I'm here to support you. Freezing, you might see this. I literally had a doc student, as she was giving a presentation, I started asking her questions and I don't think I'm too scary. She put her hoodie up and sat at her desk. And, you know, how does this apply to us? Well, your initial reaction might be like, what the heck? Be a professional. What's wrong with you? What's going on? But if you have the knowledge of what's happening in the threat response system, then you can pause and say, she's freezing. She's scared. She doesn't feel safe. You need to make her feel safe. Fawning, I get this a lot. Oh, professor, you are just the most wonderful thing. You are so amazing. My daughter, I see this. I like your hair. I like your hair. That's like her line because she's a little anxious. She doesn't feel safe and she wants to find that personal connection. And flocking is when we come together as a community to do things. One thing to remember is that our past trauma informs these responses. And we don't know, nobody walks around with a sign on their head and said, here's all my past trauma. I might be acting differently than you would expect. So our knowledge of that helps us insert this pause button and we can, let me think. Let me think where this might be coming from. There's something happening. It doesn't make it right or wrong. It just helps us understand better what is happening. And then our response to that cannot add to the trauma. Maybe our response can make this person feel safe so that they can come out of whichever space they're in. So how do I do that? So I have some knowledge of these Fs, these threat response system that you're talking about. You do it with safety, connection, and empowerment. Connection and belonging, you could use those words interchangeably, but at the heart of everything is safety. How can I do that? Well, we can help to co-regulate. So how do I strengthen an individual's self-regulation? I can provide warm, responsive relationships. This is actually, strangely enough, despite the fact that I do this for a living, it takes me a little bit. I am an introverted researcher and I don't have a lot of social needs. We all have social needs, but on a continuum, I certainly am on the other end, happy to sit with my dog alone in a room and work on my computer. But I have realized that I need to open up and take that minute to provide that warm, authentic relationship. How's your day? Not just checking everything off the list, and having that safe space. It seems so simple. It's so small, but it's everything. We can help others to co-regulate. We can teach regulation skills without ever teaching or coaching anyone on anything, just by how we act, how I hold myself in relation to that. If when my student threw her hoodie up and I yell, "What's wrong with you? Be a professional, stand up," I'm not teaching her that I am regulated, I'm being reactive. So if I can teach her in a different way how to be safe, how to express your concerns and your fears by doing it myself, I'm modeling proper regulation skills. I can also structure the environment. This is particularly useful in like classrooms and school buildings and social service agencies. I do a lot of work in a particular community area in Chicago. We changed the lounges in the housing centers. We've changed the fidget rooms in the high schools. Wherever we are, we want to create it where, and it's culturally appropriate. So depending on, and this community happens to be largely Latino, so we change the structure of that so that it's safe. Change the structure of your meetings. If you're in an organization, sometimes people open up with a sharing moment, and that sounds a little like, it might be a little too extremist on one end for you, but just a couple minutes for people to connect. You go back to that positive childhood experiences, and do I have a social support system? Do I feel safe? And you feel safe when you're flocking and you feel connected to other human beings. So another way to look at this in our knowledge and strategies category, think of human beings as being able to help one another regulate. What is regulate? We're calming down and strengthening the flexibility of our Fs, of our stress response system. We do it all the time, and we see it done in these caregiver child dyads. There's mirror neurons. Think of this. When you hold a baby and you smile at the baby and the baby smiles back at you, how do they know to do that? They have mirror neurons, and they're looking at you and they're following your lead. I'm telling you that the 40-year-old sitting next to you can follow your lead as well. This has to do with attachment systems and how we feel safe and we feel secure. This kind of goes back to some Erickson and even Freudian stuff in those first 5 years of life. The most obvious way we see this is in children. So think of it that way. I see it in my dog every day. If I get upset, oh, he's not happy. So how does a community help to regulate? Well, think of it this way. We all come in every day into every different community setting in whatever different state we're in. I told you I had a bear chasing me yesterday. At least my mind was telling me there was a bear chasing me. And we all have these monkey brains where our minds are going, look for the fear, look for the fear, look for the fear. And you're all over the place. And some of us, some days are like, ooh, I'm in a certainly calm space. We're all in different spaces at different times. What do we do to help regulate the capacity of each other? Well, we got to have those basic safety needs met first. Positive relationships, like I said, those what seems relatively meaningless to us, task-driven people, take a minute to say hello. Take a minute to have an authentic, warm relationship with someone. Routines, particularly good for children. After this, we go to that. And a sense of meaning or purpose in some kind of consistent way. Wherever you can give anyone, whether it's your clients, your children, your colleagues, a sense of meaning and purpose in a consistent way over time, you're going to strengthen their stress response system because they're going to start feeling calmer. They're going to start feeling safer. There's also culturally appropriate community activities like drumming, singing, knitting, gardening. Again, you're the experts on you and your context, so this is how you would do that in your world. Community capacity building, a couple just strategies to toss out for you: potluck meals, dance parties. We do parent universities, where if you're trying to bring the parents into the school setting, civic action. passing on the knowledge, teaching the science, teaching what you know. I didn't include it in this video, but there's a whole video on Flip Your Lid. Love it. It's a 5-minute video. I share it with my child, and I have for several years. And I think helping to understand what's going on in your brain when you get in these states is very helpful to people. So what does community have to do with the brain? Everything. And the good thing is you're already doing a lot of this. You have to start counting it. You have to start counting it as a building block to success of creating a thriving, setting, whatever your setting is. So if we think of 3 takeaways here, there is a cumulative effect of positive experiences. The more, the better. And all of those positive experiences that seem like nothing, it seemed like nothing when you took a minute to regulate your response system and have a genuine positive human experience with your colleague, with your client, with a student, with whoever is in your context, you're helping them. And we're going to count it. Check. Yay, we did something. Communities can intentionally create strategies, whether that be structuring your meetings where you start off in a certain way, or putting ACEs on your agenda, or thinking about self-care and resilience as important things, not those things. I know in our society, it's very much like, well, beat yourself to death with work and then race off 1 week a year and get it all out. How do we build in intentionally where we make it okay for one another to have strategies that help calm us? We can do all of this with a kiss. You're spreading the knowledge. You're going to have some insightful moments. You're going to seek new knowledge. You're going to add some strategies, try them out. Some are going to work, some aren't going to work. And eventually we'll get to that structural policy change. For me at my university, one of the biggest structural changes we make that helps me is loosen up a little bit on the grades are due at this moment in this time, because my student body is highly traumatized with high past ACEs. It doesn't always work on the day and time that you want it to work. So we need a little bit of flexibility to better serve their needs. So what do we do today? So much of this is out of our control. What's in our control? First, we understand, because we have the knowledge, that resilience is not built in isolation. It's taught, it's modeled, and it's promoted. The more we can take care of ourselves, self-care, and build our own resilience. And yes, I'm saying actually take a moment for you. You matter because you're part of this community. The more we can promote and model proper self-regulation for others. And we need to acknowledge those small steps, those building blocks, those small wins, small wins, small wins. So today you can consider everything you've done to create a resilient setting. Did you smile? We don't see each other. We have masks on right now. That might not apply. Are you showing empathy? Are you otherwise serving as a healthy, emotionally regulated colleague today? These are at the individual level, some small things you can do. And then you can start spreading the word. And as you have insightful moments, you can communicate that to your peers and your colleagues. Remember, it's all about the small wins. So you see the guys way up there on, or the lady on the left side, because they took baby step, baby step, baby step, pat on back, baby step, baby step, baby step. These big, massive, we're going to do it next week, we're going to do a complete overhaul, don't work. Stay the course. Make this intentional in whatever setting you're working in, and pick some small wins. And once you have that, pick some new small wins, and you will find that people start jumping on board with the way you want to do things. So I think we are up to our time, and I want to open it up to questions. I will come back and see. Okay, any questions for me?
Right now, we don't have any questions in the Q&A.
I think there's not one right answer, because the question is, how would one bring KISS to organizations or systems? It depends. So, and I'll share my own little dirty laundry a little bit. I'm at a university who we very much want to, and we talk about and coined the term trauma-informed university. And yet it's really hard. We are siloed in many ways. So it depends on your organizational structure. I think usually you have a gatekeeper or a couple gatekeepers, and you start spreading the knowledge and the language. I think it all starts with knowledge. As you start spreading the knowledge, you will find that people are like, ah, they have these aha moments, this, oh, that, yeah. And then you can start coming up with the strategies. And it's a constant circle. That's why I think we're struggling to come up with a good visual for KISS, because you go back to gaining more knowledge. Hey, how are people doing it in our setting? Oh, yeah, that would work here. And it's this back and forth process. I'd start with well, you started today with the knowledge. And then whatever insight you have, or you look at your context and you say, what's one small thing I could do? What's something I could do in my setting? It could be personal, on your own personal level. It could be as simple as supporting someone else's self-care practices. It could be, we're going to start every meeting with a moment of connection, creating a more community and creating safety. So you have to kind of think through that in your own systems. Oh, okay. Let's see, a peer support worker who also has lived in foster care, past trauma. Oh, thank you. Yeah, and it's just a start. Everybody remember that, because I swear it took me and my team a good 9 months to really, and I already was working in child welfare.
We did have one question come through. What's an example that you've seen of something small that created a meaningful difference? Do you have any stories that you can share?
Okay, that's a good question. And there's so many different contexts you can look at this in. I would think probably I have to, and I almost hate to do this because it's almost cliche, going back into the school systems, the K through 12 school systems, and not automatically presuming that our children are evil and bad, and setting up a system to better understand them. So it might sound counterintuitive, but we have problems with attendance with children with high ACEs for myriad of reasons, whether that be the mom had a schizophrenic break last night, or the parents are on drugs and alcohol, or AWOL, or the dad got locked up last night. There's many, many, many reasons. And I think loosening that structure to not automatically bring the hammer down and ask and have a human relationship. Yes, there are expectations, but here's a safe space for you to go. And in our world, I mean, we literally, for those, sometimes we have students that wander the hallways, they wander because they don't feel safe in that world, maybe because they're very behind or they're not catching on and they're terrified they're going to be called on. So we have in-school suspensions as opposed to suspensions, where they can go to a room and sometimes they do yoga. And that might seem like we're reinforcing bad behavior, but it's putting them in a space where they need to be before they can learn. They need to feel safe and secure. Did I miss anything else?
Yeah, we had a couple more questions come through. One is, can you share any examples of meeting facilitation using KISS?
Oh, that, I don't know. I think you'd have to break it down. I don't know that you're going to use all of the KISS. I think some things that we've done is, you know, sticking with the knowledge part in the beginning. So what's a new thing you learned about this? And I've seen groups do this where they come together and, well, what did we learn this week? Well, this was pretty cool. Did you see this? So it might just be kind of information sharing and knowledge building in the beginning. But another way that you can do that is kind of like, okay, what's our strategy for today? Or what's our strategy for this week? You know, what is the one key thing we're going to do to help one another remain self-regulated? And you have to constantly remind people. I have a student doing her dissertation on self-care, and yet she still forgets when she gets caught in the culture that is trying to get all this done, and pushes things on other people that maybe are not so caring. Well, what was our other question? Common barrier to providing trauma-informed care in schools? Administration. That's probably the most common barrier. Depending on the school system, I see a couple things. so many rules and regulations and so much rigid bean counting that we don't have the ability to be as flexible as we need to be within our school settings. And I lost the second part of that question. Where did that go? Oh, I think I don't know where it went. I lost the question somehow. But in the school setting, that is by far the number one thing that I see is the superintendents. Are there any policy and structural changes? So usually for a school setting to change, it needs to be more than just one teacher that's interested. We need somebody on board understanding why this is important.
A question came through. How have you handled resistance to moments of connection? An example like sharing at the start of meetings.
This is always a culturally sensitive, right? And I mean that in its broadest sense. I'm in higher ed. I mean, we are in a way left of center world where we all open meetings with our pronouns, and I don't even think most of us know that that would be bizarre in many other worlds, like the business community. So it really depends on your structure. Funny thing is, I don't attend many of the meetings at my school that do some of this, because for me, my personal space would be alone. I'm an introvert, so my self-care would be much better without 20 other people sitting around me. The biggest way you can overcome the barrier is to make sure all the stakeholders have a say in it. You know, what do we want to do? What could we do that would be meaningful? What could we do that would be useful? What could we do that would be helpful? And having them have a stake, you're empowering them to be part of what's going to happen.
We have just a couple more. We'll try to get through as many as we can. In the child welfare world, as an employee, how do you recommend asking your employer to provide more space for community connection?
Oh, that so depends on your context. So I assume we're talking like pre-K or Head Start or early childhood, some kind of early childhood programming. I think you actually have a better chance of getting your employer to understand this with the younger than 5. Maybe not during COVID, but the younger, because a lot of it is kind of nowadays mandated where you have to involve parents in certain things. And I don't know that I can fully answer it because it's so contextual to your particular setting. Was there a follow-up to that?
No, but the person, if they want to maybe retype the question and add a little bit more context to it. While we wait to do that, a couple other questions. Are you aware of any school settings using the ACE assessment as a primary prevention?
Yeah, it gets slippery slope, right? So yes, so in the high school that I do most of my work in, we have a healthcare center there, and we have used it. Now, the problem with that is ACEs do not equate to trauma. So although ACEs are one predictive factor, it all depends on the experience of that individual. So just because I have high ACEs doesn't mean I am having a traumatic response to it. So yes, we use it, but anytime we use any kind of screen, I would caution, what does that mean? And you'd have to accompany that with something that adds meaning to those numbers. I get a little nervous, even. I know California started using this for in pediatrician visits and it's a good thought, but of course in our systems I get a little bit afraid of what's the system going to do with that information. I think I see something. Is there something related to past traumas and the brain memory loss? Yes. Well, I think it was 5 or 6 rows down on that old chart. You know, memory retrieval and storage is definitely connected to high ACEs. We have 3 more minutes. Any?
Yeah, so there, one other question, how do ACEs take shape differently across various cultural contexts? For example, in indigenous communities, are they universal?
I don't know that we know that. So that's a really good question. And as flawed as the 10 ACEs are, you know, across, you know, your traditional white American population in, you know, continental US, I would say I would go in with eyes wide open and a question mark. Are these the right things within our community? Does it make sense? I am pretty certain if I had to take a leap and guess that we can say past trauma without a resilient context leads to current problems of mental and physical health and early death. What those past traumas are probably look a little bit differently across cultures.
Great. And just last, it was the follow-up to the question about the workplace setting. And it looks like it was just in their own personal workplace that the supervisor starts the meeting with an, okay, let's get started, with a frown and a sigh.
Yeah. Sometimes that can be me because, like I say, I'm very task oriented and I got to remember that human side. I think there a lot of the knowledge comes into play. Just understanding, hey, we learned a little something about the, you know, creating really resilient context, and let's shift this a little. And you would know your supervisor and the people around you better to know how to approach that with them, or if you approach it around them, or how you plant that seed. But, you know, let me report back on some things I learned from my training I attended this last week. Might start planting seeds.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Fromm-Reed, for joining us today. Your presentation was so insightful. I've taken a lot away. So thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you, DOH, for putting the training series on, and for everyone who joined us this morning as well, and for your really thoughtful questions. I think it helped richen the conversation. Just as a reminder, this is the second in a 4-part series, so we'll have 2 additional trainings in September. Please check your email as more information becomes available. And then I'd like to invite you all to join the Hawaii Children's Trust Fund Coalition meeting. It's on August 20th at 9 a.m. This is our statewide coalition that focuses on child abuse and neglect prevention. I'm going to put the link to register in the chat. Dr. Fromm-Reed has generously shared her slides with us, and so I'll send those out to the folks that attended today, as well as the recording. Thanks you all for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.